Robert Dakota of Worldviews Media, and I'm really happy to be here with Freddy Silva. He has so much amazing information to offer, and thank you for joining us here today, Freddy.
My pleasure, Robert.
As I've traveled around the Pacific and many other countries where I've met indigenous people and spoke to them about their stories, they all seem to have a very similar story and they share a lot of different things in common, like symbols, foods, like words, architecture, textiles, all kinds of things that they share in common. It leads me to believe that we have a lot more in common than we have in difference, and that it's important to remember these stories.
They've already disappeared. They've left behind something that we inherited, and it was amazing to travel, especially around the Pacific, and find out how so much of their stories are so beautifully woven, but they're also overlap. So you'd find a story in, let's say, Thailand that completely overlaps with the Hopi, and something with the Hopi that overlaps with the Dogon. The Dogon would overlap with Mesopotamia, and so on and so forth. So we're talking about a memory of things, a memory of events and people and culture that is gone, destroyed by a major cataclysm. So the fact that all of these people are talking that supposedly never talked to each other and never got around outside of a 30-mile radius, they all have the same overlapping stories. And I find that a very credible piece of information because it comes from them.
That was another thing. The more I traveled, the more and spoke with indigenous peoples, the more that I kept hearing the same story. And of course, Joseph Campbell was a big influence on me after theology school. So I got this picture that, wow, we have a lot more in common actually than we have in difference. Why not focus on the things we have in common? Feature those things, and it seems like it's more than abundant.
Exactly. I mean, one of the things that amazed me is I stumbled upon the history, the oral traditions, which have just been published, of a people that no one's ever heard of called the Waitaha in New Zealand. You
I
used to be,
have.
yeah, good. Living in, there's two of us now, war obviously. But even people in New Zealand are not aware of them, which is astonishing for such a small population. And it's astonishing how their stories about the gods traveling to Easter Island on the way from South America to the birthplace of the gods, which is a place I've been to now 6 times. I'm hoping to go again in April. How this story overlaps with the stories of South America and the stories of Egypt, and how they describe things in intimate detail 11,000 years ago when, I quote, the stars shone in a different sky, in a different pattern. So we're talking about a time of precession when, the shapes of the constellations as we know them today were very, very different, which tells you how long this oral tradition has been going. And of course, that overlaps with the Aboriginal cultures who remember meteorite strikes a million years ago, and that's just been proven by certain geologists as well. And they're scratching their heads saying, if these people witnessed these meteorites crashing, because there is no evidence to show that meteorite landed in this region, and we found the meteorite and they can remember it, therefore it stands to reason that they must have been witnesses to the event a million years ago. To which the Aborigines will say, duh. It's almost quite comical when you actually sit down with these wonderful people and hear their stories and see them all synchronizing so beautifully.
Also, they knew about Sirius B, right? That the Dogon knew where that was before the astronomers did, and they were talking about that before.
And their descriptions of the global flood at the end of the Younger Dryas are quite astonishing. I said that if anybody survives reading the second chapter of my book, they'll be doing pretty well because when you read them all together as overlaps, you get to see a sense that you're actually there witnessing something. They see the same problem from slightly different angles, but together they create a very coherent picture as far away as the Himalaya. So again, we keep forgetting that myth is actually a wonderful theatrical device to help you remember something. I mean, we could sit here and talk about the story of a princess that's rescued from a spaceship to save the galaxy from a dark force. We call it Star Wars. Unless you embellish that in a very dramatic narrative, you tend to just forget that within a week. You'll think that's a great story at the time at the pub, but a week later you're onto something else. The point of myth is to memorialize outstanding events for the people. Again and again, thousands of years later, we'll still be retelling the tale. This is why the Greek stories are so wonderful. Many of them are regurgitations of Egyptian stories, which themselves are a part of memory that go back 36,000 years, according to one papyrus. So there's a wonderful device to have to memorialize these events. But until you understand that mechanism, you'll always say, well, myth is kind of fiction. Well, not to the people that wrote it, it wasn't. It was a great way to make sure that the story would never be forgotten, so we wouldn't, go through the same problems, which we will, and we are right now, and not remember how we coped with them in the past. So they're actually doing us a favor by giving these wonderful stories. The trick is you have to think like an ancient to unravel the myth because the language can be so obtuse. It's written for a different audience of a different era. You have to be patient with it. It's almost like the Grail legend. Even that's only 800 years old, and yet you have to be patient with the Grail stories to understand what it's trying to tell you. And once you sit with it, you've got a wealth of information on multiple levels. So it's important to understand these mechanisms in order to understand how our past used to be.
Speaking of the Waitaha, I was down there in New Zealand with some Maori and Waitaha in 2007. And I heard a lot of stories about giants is one thing I wanted to bring up.
Yes.
But also before going there, when they get together for a reunion, they spend hours, even days, reciting their lineage, and they have it memorized. And they can go back and they have to sit there and listen to the whole thing for 4 days before getting on with the festivities or whatever.
It reminds me of the meeting of the trees in Lord of the Rings, where they take forever to sit around and just get to the basis of what they're going to describe. In a
Yeah.
way, it's a matter of pride for the married to sit at a meeting, even at a council meeting, and describe their lineage. 10 minutes later, you can start talking and ask the question. I totally agree, and their stories are wonderful, but it's amazing how few people in New Zealand are aware of this. There is a huge cover up going on as I stumbled into it. A good friend of mine called Gary Cook, who's also a local historian, he was feeding me a lot of the information that I had helped me to get my book going on that subject. And he also mentions a lot of Maori traditions about the hill of the red-haired giants, and the Maori was still contending with them. This is on the North Island, and somewhere it's not far from Auckland actually. And they were saying that even in the 18th century and as long as the 19th century, the Maori were still contending with them. And they said, well, they're about up to 12 feet tall, and they're just kind of a part of a dead race. They just want to keep themselves to themselves, and we kind of just leave them alone. Sometimes they frighten the hell out of us because they're kind of big people. But once in a while, one of them will wash up on the beach, and I came across a story of a young girl who, the school was cancelled because of bad weather one day, and she went for a walk on the beach, and the tide had washed away a bit of the sand during a storm, and there was I think it was a 14 or 16-foot tall humanoid with red hair all the way covering his body, just lying there. The flesh was still attached to the bone. So she runs back to the house. She's a bit distressed, obviously. And she tells her mother. Her mother calls the local council. They bring a flatbed truck, put the body on the back of the flatbed truck. And that's the last time you'll hear about that story. And there was a local investigative journalist that found the story about 30 years later, decided to bring it up again, and he lost his job because he was poking his nose into things that they said, just leave him. We don't want to insult the Maori. But the Maori told us about the story. Who are we insulting? In fact, you're insulting them by not actually saying that the story was actually true. We have now the evidence and the proof to show that they were not making this stuff up because they had the same story in the Solomon Islands as well. And the giants there are very much alive and well, as any US military people know today. They even sleep with revolvers under their pillows, not because they're going to be attacked by Japanese soldiers that think the Second World War is still taking place and they're lost in the jungle. But because they said, and I quote, when you see one of these 16-foot tall redhead giants walking through the forest by the camp, it kind of is a little bit upsetting. So we take precautions. They don't hurt us. They don't mean us any harm, but still, there is that thought in the back of your mind that something could happen and you'd be totally outmanned. So the military don't talk about those kind of things unless they're true.
I've heard stories about giants in uh, Maui and Japan,
Yes.
Okinawa, New Zealand, Easter Island, Peru, Chile, all over the place, especially here in the Southwest. The Paiute had the fight with the giants, the red-haired giants, and
Yeah.
finished them off in the Southwest.
And the Sioux as well.
Uh-huh. I didn't know that.
Yeah, and they were escaping from the eastern Appalachia. The story goes, and this goes back to the Cree. I believe they're in Georgia, and they said that by the time the Navajo had moved over to the Appalachia and met the Cree, the Navajo also knew about them, and they said, well, by the time we met up with them, and this was thousands of years ago, they don't keep time like we do. But they're saying in a remote period of time, we basically found these tall people who were about 8 to 12 feet tall, depending on who you talk to. And they said that there were the remains of a once proud civilization of astronomers and navigators that lived on an island that sank in a major catastrophe when the Earth was flooded, a long, long, long time ago. And which kind of, brings up the A word immediately. And they said that we felt sorry for them because they turned into inbreed because every time they bred with human women, the women would die during childbirth. They would give birth to fully grown infants, obviously. And so they had to interbreed and they'd lost hope. They had nowhere to go. They knew their time was up. And in honor of them and their knowledge, we incorporated all their teachings into the Navajo tradition so that they would never be forgotten. And the name that they had was the Alawani, and we eventually gave their name to one of the major rivers in the eastern United States, which goes through Pittsburgh, called the Allegheny. So that's where the name comes from. And eventually, the last of their kind reached Lompoc in outside of Los Angeles, and there was a grave that was found there in 1923. It was dug up by the Army Corps of Engineers, and they brought a shaman over to look at this very, very tall humanoid buried in a porphyry grave. And the shaman said, yeah, this is one of the last of the Alawani. They moved all the way here, hoping to join their friends on Catalina Island. Never made it. That was the last of their kind. So, yeah, it's funny what happens when you ask the local people for the truth. Get a very more interesting story.
Yeah. Well, I in theology school, I had to study the ancient Near East, and I had to study, all the ancient cultures so that I could understand the context of the content.
Yeah.
And one of the things that caught me off guard while studying the Old Testament was in Genesis. If I'm not mistaken, I'm still having it right. It's Genesis 6, where they talk about the Nephilim, who came down and bore children with the daughters of men, and they created a race of giants. And I'm thinking, wow, this is right in the Bible. I've never heard this in Sunday school. I never heard this ever. Why am I only hearing about it in graduate school?
I know. It should raise eyebrows right there, shouldn't it? Have you ever tried to go back to the source of the Bible?
I've seen a lot of, there's a lot of different issues. Certain things were written at different times. Some things that are written in the third person are not written by that person probably, and they can tell that. And there's a lot of discrepancies. Sometimes they go back and change things. Of course,
Oh,
um,
absolutely.
the Council of Trent and
Yeah.
Nicaea.
And you got Zechariah Sitchin throwing into the mold.
Oh yeah, Zacharias.
Always translating things correctly, which has created a huge amount of problems for people that like his work. And I used to like his work, but you sometimes got to take his work with a grain of salt because he did make up a lot of stuff. not to throw all his work out, because it does serve a great purpose. He was a pioneer in that region. But if you go back to the original translations of the Book of Enoch, for example, and corresponding to the earliest tablets in Mesopotamia, which precedes Sumeria, and it precedes everything that came after that, because the Babylonians were complaining that the Hebrews and the Israelites, they stole all of their mythologies and made it into the Bible. And they were complaining of plagiarism and complete manipulation of the story. They changed the position of the mountains. They made the good people into the bad people in order to assert cultural superiority to the Jewish nation, or become the Jewish nation. But then again, they did it as well, because they had also manipulated the original Sumerian story and put in some political versions of their own. So the pot calling the kettle black, of course. But the Sumerians had also slightly altered things. So by the time you get to Mesopotamia, you've got a hint of truth here. Now, when you get to one of the original and unchristianized versions of the Book of Enoch, you can compare the two, and there's some good overlays. And that's what I found exciting. That and you're quite right. There was a group of craftspeople called Watchers. They were sort of surrounding the lords of Anu, who we call the Anunnaki, or the Anunnaki, as they call them in India, otherwise known as people of the serpent, which is a very long global tradition of people, by the way, which I'll talk about at the conference. And they were saying that they were told not to mix around with humans for a lot of reasons, because they were mostly undeveloped back then. So when you give advanced information to people who are not yet quite on the educational level, the two make very bad bedfellows, as did the genetic makeup of the Watchers and human women. They said, under no circumstances mate with human women. Problems will arise. You're just not made of the same stuff. Or as the humans call them, they were human-like but not quite human. That was always their little catchphrase. So there was a small group of Watchers that obviously betrayed the version of the story of the rules. Unfortunately, all the Watchers get lumped into the same bowl as being bad people. Not the case at all. There was one small group of miscreants that misbehaved. They mated with human women, and yes, those gave birth to to very large people, very, very, very tall people, not quite giantesque. The problem comes with the next generation, when the offspring of the Watchers mated on the next iteration. Those are the ones that created true giants, real abominations. And they were called a Nephilim, which means Orion, or the children of Orion. And that story also has a concurrence in the White tradition, Hopi tradition, and all around the world. There's a constant association with Orion as being the source of things. So yeah, it's a very complicated and convoluted story, which is why I always like going back to the earlier source material before it's had a chance to be totally polluted. So you have a chance of at least stumbling upon the truth.
Yeah, it seems like all of these stories, like Joseph Campbell purports, is that they have general themes in common. And where they overlay with these themes, the story or the god, or may have a different name, or it may have different characters, but the theme of the story is the same.
Yeah,
Like the corn maiden all over the planet, how plants came to civilization seems to be a familiar reoccurring theme.
exactly.
And
Like himself, Enoch was not the real name. His real name was Emet Ur Anu. So the writer of the Book of Enoch was himself associated or part of the lineage of the Anunnaki, the people of the serpent. I never knew that either.
wow. And then you have the Hopi that are the people of the serpent, also connected with Orion, as you said.
And Anunnaki are two words in the Hopi language as well.
Yes.
The red, if I remember correctly, they are the red people, red-skinned people of the orange-colored sand. To give it its full actual translation, took me a while to get hold of the Hopi English dictionary, but my God, when you look at the etymology of words, it's very interesting how these things get handed down to us. And of course, the original people were the Hirsat Sinon, who became known as the Anasazi, and the Hopi and Anasazi are pretty much linked at the hip when you go back to the time of the flood.
Wow. Yeah, you probably know of Gary David's work,
I
um,
do, yes.
and he talks about the words Anu, I believe, relate to an ant, and the pharaoh ant in particular, which is interesting in of itself. And Egypt and Tibet share words with Hopi as well. So that's
Yeah, I mean, and the ant has two layers of information. One, they were associated them with red ant people because the red ant is a very industrious little critter. And these people were apparently builder gods. They were real people with hands-on expertise. So they gave him that aphorism in order to give him a kind of a shape to ground him in reality. But there was also a symbolic connection which is to do with the fact that the body of the ant comes in three parts, much like the stars of the belt of Orion. And that was their link, their way of associating the original people, Hisatsinom, and also, I forget the name of one of their particular people who helped the Hopi get out of their sinking land in the middle of the Pacific and get them to reach North America. um, they basically wanted to maintain that link with Orion, which of course Gary did a lovely job actually linking the position of the main places of the Hopi in the southwest and as a mirror image of the constellation of Orion. So it's wonderful to see how we're all thinking in different from different points of view, but we're reaching overlapping stories. It's one of the wonderful things of doing this research because none of us are really talking to each other. We don't know what each one of us are doing, but somehow we seem to be overlapping the stories just so well that between all of us we create a very, very big picture, and that's what excites me about all of this.
yes, absolutely. I've been tracking this thing down since I was in theology school because it didn't jive. So
Yeah,
how do I resolve that? And Joseph Campbell sort of gave me the permission to look deeper and look in other places.
yeah.
And I just love it. It's like the greatest mystery story ever.
I mean, it's I mean, you take the story of Jesus, for example, or Yeshua ben Yosef, to call him by his real name. If you track the story of what he was professing, which was the art of living resurrection, which is what the Gnostic Christians were prescribing, you can try trace that back all the way through the Middle East and beyond that to a book that ironically was published by an author on the same roster in my present publisher. And he learned ancient Japanese just to understand this book. And I was in the process of writing a book called The Lost Art of Resurrection because I wanted to find out how far back this story really goes. And incredibly, I read his account of his translation of a book that goes back to at least 8000 BC in Japan called the Kujiki 72, in which they describe the whole purpose of the living resurrection ritual through a method of teaching called the 17 Ways, which incredibly survives in the 17 teachings of Scottish Rite Freemasonry, which traces its lineage all the way back to the time of the flood. So we're
Wow.
talking circular processes here. But again, it's just making the point that whatever we take to be very recent and concurring history is actually much, much older. And we now have the people with the time, the understanding, and the breadth of inquiry to be able to put these things together. So, and I wish I could remember this guy's name because it did me a huge favor, and I probably will in the next 10 minutes. But yeah, if the Kujiki 72 is your thing, and again, it's a very obtuse book. You really have to sit with it quietly. But once you see it in relation to the traditions of the Far East, Polynesia, even North American, Native American traditions, you see how we're following the very same tradition. And for 1 minute, the Gnostic Christianity tradition nearly succeeded Catholicism. There was that one moment where they had the opportunity to win the argument and win the fight, but because there was a lot of skullduggery that was going on behind the scenes with the emperors, they were betrayed by one of their kind, and Catholicism won, and Gnostic Christianity lost. It could have so easily gone the other way. So today, much of the Western world could be practicing what essentially is a very, very ancient tradition, possibly the world's oldest tradition, which goes back to Japan.
Wow, that's really fascinating to me as well because I spent a lot of time in Japan. I've been there 12 times.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and I just love their culture because whatever thin threads we have to the ancient past, they're one of the ones holding on to it.
I totally agree.
And when I was
And there's
down in,
in English.
what's that?
There's so little available in English. That's the hard part for us.
Yes, yes. I was
How's your
down in,
Japanese?
sorry?
How's your Japanese?
Not so good. It's good enough to get me by, to be polite and ask questions, and I can hear things better than I can speak things actually. I can hear where generally the conversation's going.
Yeah.
But when we were in Okinawa and other places, other sacred sites, there's this legend about a blonde-haired giant,
Yeah.
especially one that comes from Iriamote to Miyako Island and saves the island. And it's so important to them that they had a bronze statue of this guy. And when I first saw him, I thought, wow, it doesn't look like a Japanese physique. It looks more like a Western physique. And then I read the plaque and I was like, wow, this just fits right into the story.
Yeah.
And then on the primary school, they had the story painted on the side of the building. And they do this festivity every year where they retell the story every year.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And it
What time of the year? Do you know?
I think it's some of the spring festivals, if I remember correctly. For some reason, I'm thinking spring equinox or somewhere around there, or summertime, because everyone was dressed really lightly. Yeah, I,
Well, that's incredible. And they talk about the flying rock boats, some of which you find in the mountains around Mount Miwa as well, which is fascinating. And
wow.
how it came from what appears to be the Indochina mainland, where they had a lot of very interesting things carved out of big rocks. They really were, as the Waitaha call them, the keepers of stone. It's the same story that you find in South America, the keepers of stone that built Tiwanaku. And that's a 6,000-mile span right there. The same people building the same things, being called by the same name. Yeah, I do agree. I think Japan has a lot to teach us in that respect about ancient culture, and slowly the information is getting out because, again, the academics, you've got that knee-jerk reaction when someone says, "Well, actually, our culture is older than 1008 BC." Suddenly, boom, you no longer publish. It's the same story that happens in the West. You contradict the official line of things. You consider to be a lunatic or a moron. So slowly, the pushback is being pushed back as well. So I would like to be invited to go to Japan one day because I would love to go and see some of that stuff with my own eyes.
Oh,
Because sometimes it takes an outsider to see what local people can't see, and that's so true of every culture, because you're not sort of hemmed in by the restrictions of that culture. You have permission to explore and to make mistakes and fall over, and also to find extraordinary things. But I do agree, there's some very big secrets there. And the more we can stumble upon them, and independent researchers that go out of their way to point out the truth of things, like the origin of Shinto, that has its origin all the way back to 8,000 BC, which is something you never hear about. It does begin to sort of put all the threads together in this global story. But when I was doing my original research on crop circles, we found that there were technological blueprints being given out in the original ones before the hoaxing took over the phenomenon, which it has today. But the original information that we're being given, we were told that there were technological blueprints and there were three scientists, and I can't reveal who they are. I mean, I'm bound to secrecy for their own sake. And there's two in London, one in Oklahoma, and I believe there's two in Australia, and they've come up with exactly the same story. In fact, we didn't tell them anything. They found out under their own guise that if you take certain crop circles from the early 1990s and from the late 80s and you put them together, you do get a technological printout which enables you to build an anti-gravity device. And they've all built it in their laboratories or garages, and they said it works, but we can't bring this out right now. We've got to wait for the right politically expedient moment to announce this. Otherwise, we're gone. And then there goes all the story. But the funny thing is, we had that. information given to us by a renowned psychic in England before the crop circle phenomenon even began. So in a matter of speaking, the story goes from psychic story to me and a group of other researchers trying to back up what the psychic is saying, finding out it's true, putting the information out there, and 3 different groups of scientists actually picked up on it and they built a damn thing. So it's all out there. We have all the information we need, but a smart person knows when to, stick their head above the castle wall or just to hide behind it for a few years longer. That's just the way it is on Earth. You got to be smart.
You gotta be smart because I mean it's a really dangerous world, and those people who have that quote unquote power like to retain it. So
Yeah, they're running out of time.
I believe so. It seems like it, and I'm really hopeful because I think all these spiritual traditions. That's why I banked my education on theology school. I think something's going to happen to help us in a really terrible crisis. And I think all this research that's going on is going to assist that somehow. I really believe that the solution, the spiritual solutions, are some of the most effective, but take a long time to develop.
Oh, absolutely right. In fact, without giving the end away to my current book, so actually I found a bit of a hurdle in wrapping up what I was trying to write about this missing civilization. And it was getting into the concept of recurring catastrophes, and it's getting a bit negative or a bit dark anyway. And I don't really get into the dark stuff. I mean, you have to accept that it's there. You've got to bring it out. I mean, the luck favors the prepared. And unless you don't understand what's happening around you and in the sky above you, you're doomed to repeat the problems that our predecessors had. And I had exactly the same situation where the answer, actually, we have it right now. It's been with us for the last 3 decades at least. And it's all to do with the power of conscious intent and directed focus intent. And one of the landmark things that I always come back to was at Princeton University, where there was a group of engineers who sat around a room and said, what if it's possible to measure intent? And they found a way to do it using a special device. And one of the landmark experiments that they did was using a computer that was giving out a drum beat. Now, a computer is a machine that's electronically wired and it's giving you a beat. There's no way you're going to interfere with that, right? Well, the idea was that you tune 23 people to think of the same thing towards the same outcome, and you get to focus their intent on changing the beat of that machine. And there's a peer-reviewed journal, which I believe is still on the Princeton website, that concludes that yes, a group of 23 people was able to alter the drum beat of the computer. Now, what if, let's say for the sake of it, since every culture talks about that the last flood was brought about because of the Earth passing through a field of debris caused by a disintegrated meteor or a mini planet, which we go through every year, by the way.
Yes.
We go through the same field of debris every November. That's why we have the Day of the Dead on the North Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere as well.
Wow.
They're celebrating those that fell during the flood. I thought it was just a Celtic feast.
I didn't know that.
Oh, it's very weird. I always thought it was to do with the Celtic feast of Samhain. It's not. And they still, in parts of the Pacific, they still celebrate the people that died in the flood and those that survived. So it's not just the Day of the Dead, it's the Day of the Survivors as well. Now, put those two scenarios together. This happens every November. NASA, in fact, all astronomical people in the world, without a week goes by where there isn't a warning about some near-Earth asteroid. Every single week there's another thing. And I've talked to NASA people and they said, it's funny how we are so obsessed with the sky, with near-Earth objects, to the same degree that the ancestors were 10,000 years ago in all the myths. Look at the sky, look what's happening. Be aware of what's going on. This is why the Mayans had long-range calendars, because it doesn't serve a farmer to think about 14,000 year calendar. I mean, they're not going to be alive to plant seeds 14,000 years from now. Why should they care? Now, suppose you got a problem where you are faced with totally mutually assured destruction. The power of focused intent by 23 people to act on the outcome of a machine, what would happen if 1% of the population of the Earth, because that's all it would take, to send their thought out to move large objects coming in. Now, that I find very compelling. I think that the reason why so many of the stories of our ancestors said that, yeah, the gods were here, they mostly died during the flood, along with most humans. Few survived, along with a few humans. And then the gods gave us civilization and they vanished, disappeared, never came back. Sometimes they come back here and there just to fine tune things, as the Hopi say. And I'm thinking, why should they now have just gone away? And I'm wondering, perhaps that was the whole point in this particular cycle of civilization, to leave it up to us to figure out that we too are gods. We can do exactly what they could do, because a god is nothing more than a person that understands the laws of nature. And if you understand the laws of nature, you can interact with nature and you can manipulate it in a good way. And I'm thinking that we're now reaching a point of, the near end scenario is kind of dawning on us in the third decade of the 20th century, as many astronomers and mathematicians agree, by the way. And I'm thinking, if we're faced with an end scenario and we know we can prove now what we can do with focused intent, this would be the ultimate test of human beings to elevate ourselves above barbarity. We can use our God given ability to shape the outcome, and we can become as gods. I think that's the lesson. It's a personal opinion, but it's based on so many things I've observed from where we started our conversation at the beginning with our ancestors, because they thought the same way. We can control the environment around us if we just learn the basic skills of understanding nature. Okay, it's not that difficult. It just takes a bit of courage and a bit of self-belief. So I think that when we're faced with something like that, we now have the power, as proven by science, that we can alter the outcome of things. And I find that a very positive scenario. So anybody that's under 30 years of age listening right now, this is encouraging news.
Especially when there's so much hysteria going on. If there are so many crises, the first thing to do in a crisis is don't panic.
Yeah.
Get calm, because when you're calm, then you can think much clearer what your priorities are.
Oh, there is something to be said for that. I mean, I think if you act calmly and rationally, you stand a better chance of doing things on the, out of panic and sheer desperation. You'll get somewhere, but I think you'll get further if you also understand the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is, even if you are faced with certain death, it's just a movement of atoms from this to another state, which is not that far away. It's like, as many cultures say, when you die, you're literally on the room next door. You haven't really gone anywhere. You just gone a little bit over to the left. I think if you don't attach any great importance to living or the physical world itself, you lose your fear of death to a certain degree. Or at least you lose the pain of fear, because that's what keeps us trapped in so many things. And I think that's what, for example, many of the teachings of people like the Knights Templar, or the core group of the Templars, who are essentially the regurgitation of the Essenes, are the same people 1,000 years later, if you compare the two. And most of them went to their graves, being burnt alive with a stake, and they had a big smile on their face because they understood the mechanism that surrounds us all. A temporary moment of pain is all that separates you from the next world. And from there, you can influence events taking place down here, which is why they had the audacity to even predict the death of the Pope that set them in the events into motion that killed all of them. And they got it absolutely down to, I believe, the week or the month that they predicted the Pope's death, and boom, he's gone, because they understood how the big picture works in this life and the next. They see the big picture, and they recognize that by seeing how the other world works and how you can incorporate the other world into our present line of being, you are able to manipulate events around you. It gives us a certain ability, a certain sort of astrophysical ability to see the world not for what it is, but how it actually is. You see, not the illusion of how things are perceived, but the big picture, and you can influence things. And they're able to predict events that were yet to come, and they were absolutely right. And all they were doing was doing the same technique that Native American people have been practicing for thousands of years. It was nothing really new or secret. It's just that the only reason why it was secret was because you didn't want to get that to fall into the wrong hands. You didn't want people like the Pope or Philip, the King of France, to use the same techniques against people. The idea was that you improve yourself, you improve the human condition, and you elevate others with you. That's why it was secret. So yeah, I think that if you once you lose that sort of fear, you do get a certain degree of control of your life, and it's very liberating. And I can, to a certain degree, talk from experience in my own particular journey and what I've learned. I've been challenged in this a few times during my work, and I found that actually, compared to what I was 20 years ago, I have, to a certain degree, overcome my fear, and I'm more in control than I was back then. And I have to say, it's very liberating. I can't say I'm perfect at it. The fact that we're alive and breathing and incarnated means that we are not perfect. That's why we came here. So, but you make progress. You go through life trying to improve yourself every single day, and that's true for anybody.
What was the background for you that brought you to these conclusions?
Listening to other people's stories, very old people's stories, and just having the courage to sit there and think, I thought I knew everything when I read it on Wikipedia. And it turns out that actually we're completely wrong. If you just let the people speak their truth and then you compare them, like you do, going to Japan and comparing different stories, you begin to realize that their stories all line up. Okay, it's a bit like early Christianity. Gnostic Christianity and all the other sects around the Mediterranean at that time, they all agree with each other. The only people that didn't agree were the Catholics, which makes you wonder who's telling the truth here when everybody, the Catholic Church is massacring everybody, and you think, well, why are they killing everybody else? And you think, oh, the one thing that they all had in common, even though they had their differences, is that they had the same story. They had the same underlying thesis for their belief system, and that's what the church couldn't abide. So that's why I came to this resolution in the end, was that I've been taught completely wrong. I was brought up in a Catholic system. I've been completely taught wrong. I mean, there are elements of truth within that system. You never throw out everything, of course, because so much of Catholicism is borrowed from other people, particularly the Egyptians. And and from personal experience, matched to what I've heard from other indigenous people around the world, I see the truth in every single culture, and I'm able to then form my own blueprint, which appeals to me. Because my story, Robert, is different to yours. You're here for a completely different reason than I am. And me to tell you what is true is not going to help you. All you can do is present tools, and you take the tools that you need because you're here on your particular journey. You take those tools that are appropriate, you add your experience here, and you create your own blueprint. And that's the way to self-assurance, the way to self-salvation, if you want to call it that. And I found that a much more again, tripping over it without really knowing what I'm doing, I found a sort of a way to live quite harmoniously within the world and within myself. And again, it's a process of refinement. Every single day, someone will say something that I've never heard before, and I'll go, wow, now I can reshape my thinking because that kind of makes sense. I'll take that little nugget, I'll attach it to my few nuggets, and now I've reshaped that tool. So the theory is never very concrete. You have to be willing to let the ego go away and say, I don't know everything. I am willing to change my story relative to the experience and the information that comes into my life. And then you're walking like a reed in the wind. You bend with the wind. There's nothing wrong with that. No one's going to judge you harshly if you keep bending because you didn't have it right in the first place anyway. None of us really do, I think. We'll have a bit of the truth, but not all of it. And that's what makes life paradoxically painful and fun at the same time, I think.
Yeah, so you think, thank you for that. That was a really beautiful, elegant way of presenting that. So you see this information as very pragmatic for people's everyday life. It's not just looking into history and sort of having a mental. I had to stop myself. I wanted to say a mental masturbation. I'll have to cut that out.
Oh no, leave it.
But really, some people are just regurgitating and going over ancient information, and there has to be a conclusive reason why we're spending so much time and energy in pragmatic result for it to be important to the average person. So would you say that it is?
Yeah, I think it's totally. I think it's where we go completely wrong. We're looking for a new thing all the time, a new method, new technique. But when you strip these new techniques down, they're all based on the original concept of truth anyway. They're just repackaged for a different era or to make money. And now the big thing is about ascension. Most of it is utter nonsense, complete utter nonsense. But at the core of it, there is a truth. And I find that truth in so many indigenous cultures because when it comes to that, there's nothing really new under the sun. And when you strip down these cultural beliefs that have been going around for thousands of years, which have stood the test of time and has actually helped these people through tumultuous changes in catastrophes, and they're still with us, most of these people, and we can't even keep our culture barely floating for 40 years. I mean, the American empire, which started after the Second World War, is already gone. It's finished. Let's be honest about it. And here I am speaking from Portland, Maine, by the way, as an American citizen. You got to be honest about this stuff. The Chinese culture empire has started. It's already fallen before it even began. I mean, it's 5, 10 years. It's already on its knees. These new concepts do not work. We're trying to find a new method of doing things all the time. But when you strip these methods, go back to the core essence of what they're trying to tell you, and you find those core beliefs in Aboriginal culture a million years ago, if the stories are correct, that they remember things that far back. And the concepts are very, very simple. Honor nature, honor yourself, and honor the people that you disagree with. Love thy neighbor. Do unto others as you do unto yourself. There's nothing more to add to that. The core framing of how to live life and how to be a better person, to live in harmony with the planet, you can synthesize it down to about a sentence. That's all you need to survive. Everything else is just clutter, packaging, ego, and all kinds of other problems. And they may work for people. That's great. If it works for you, I'm very happy. But the more I travel, the more I realize that we're looking for these very complicated mechanisms to get us out of this mess. We already have the mechanisms. We just make it more complicated because we want it to be complicated. When in fact, you talk to someone in the Andes from the Aymara, one of the oldest cultures on the planet, you sit with them for 10 minutes and they'll tell you all you need to know about how to live a very harmonious life in one sentence. That's what you need. And again, love thy neighbor, be honest with nature, and observe nature and ride with it. And sometimes, you will fall with nature because that's the way things are. We're not here to be for alive forever. Some people live and some people die. That's the way it works. That's the way it's always worked. The trick is to live that life harmoniously, upright, and do the best you can. Some people will die, some people will survive, but things go on. Civilization continues and it improves bit by bit by bit. So if you look at what the ancestors were saying before the flood, like the ancient Egyptians, they had the same problems that the Egyptians have today. It's incredible. You're looking back at the ancients, how incredible it was. It was incredible, the culture, but you know what? They had the same problems. The gods had the same problems too. They also fought like rivalry siblings. They had the same issues. And when you look at for example, the 39 orations of the pharaoh, that the person had to look in the mirror every morning and say these 39 quotes, like, I have not stolen my neighbor's cart. I have not taken a baby from his mother's milk. Basic things, aphorisms that you repeat every day, so that every day when you counted these things in your life, you can say, today I am not going to kill that guy. I'm going to be a better person. They were doing that 5,000 years ago. So the tools are still there. We just want to make it more difficult than it is because we want to buy more books. We want to watch more episodes on Gaia. And then we think, oh, that taught me so much. Yes, it did. But if you strip it down, it's no different to what was being said thousands of years ago. So there is a bit of humor to all of this, I think.
Yes,
You know what I'm
definitely.
saying?
Yeah, definitely.
We're
And
doing it harder for ourselves.
it's better to keep it on the light side too, and to keep it humorous. When we can go too dark, it starts taking over and bringing in depression and fear, and so yeah, I
And,
agree with you 100%.
and they're going to live up to a certain image. It's
Yes.
like people in my tours, and and they always sell out. It's I'm in a wonderful position these days, which is wonderful. And they'll come along, and after about 2 days, they'll say, I thought you were so spiritual. I said, well, I think I am. Why? What's the problem? Yeah, but you drink alcohol and you swear. I said, hell yeah. In fact, when I hear some dirty jokes, after a full day of talking spirituality, I want to sit down at the pub, have a good beer, and crack some dirty jokes just to lighten things up. You don't have to be oh so spiritual to be spiritual. You can practice that within the way you behave, the way you interact with people. It doesn't mean you have to be goody goody. You just have to be lighty lighty. That's the way you do it. In fact, if you look at the Dalai Lama's 49 aphorisms for leading a wonderful life, they're ever so logical and serious. And you get down to the very last one, which is the best one. And it says, approach love and cooking with reckless abandon. And that comes out of the Dalai Lama. And you think, I like this guy. Yeah, between him and Eckhart Tolle, Eckhart will say something really profound and then he'll crack a great joke. And I like people like that. So he'll say something that will really set your brain thinking. And you think, you know what? He's got it absolutely right there. And he goes, and if you think you're ever so spiritual, try spending a week with your parents. And he goes, damn it, he's absolutely right again. But he's right, it's the ability and the courage to sort of challenge yourself. That is so many times you're full of shit. You really are. I mean, and you've got to just step back for a little bit and just be honest with yourself and go, I'm making this a bit too difficult for myself. Just be simple and just have a good sense of humor. And once in a while, fall flat on your face and get up, dust yourself off, and try again. Try better, because that's the best you can do.
Nice. Yeah, that's such great advice, and it's the same thing I hear from all the spiritual teachers that I respect, and especially the indigenous people. They all say the same thing as well. Like, keep it simple.
The Egyptians were so upset when the god of wisdom, Tehote or Jehuti, or you may know him as Thoth, the Greek version, he invents writing and he presents it to one of the gods, like Ptah, and says, "Well, you are indeed incredibly bright that you invented writing as a way to memorize all the stuff that we keep trying to remember orally and keep in your head. But beware, words are very treacherous. And in time, humans will learn to be treacherous with these words because words are an approximation of what things truly are. So while it's a good mechanism, always have a backup plan because, words will get into a lot of trouble. And for that reason alone, the Egyptians invented the pun. Because when you're taking yourself too seriously, you start making fun of words themselves.
That's great. That's really great. Well, I could talk to you for hours, literally, Freddy.
Likewise.
Is this your first time to Sedona?
No, I've been there many, many times. In fact, one of my first times was just with a small group of people that, how will I describe this group? We quietly go around the world fixing the rubbish that people leave at sacred sites. Let's just put it that way. So we quietly clean things up. There's many groups like us that do this quietly. And one of the great privileges was to be in Sedona to have a memory of why I love that part of the world. Uh, for me, I don't need a map when I'm in Sedona. I don't need a map when I'm in Arizona or Utah or New Mexico. Even when I was growing up, and I'm Portuguese, by the way, by birth.
Oh.
I collect accents and nationalities for a living. Even when I was watching Cowboys and Indians on television and John Wayne, I always felt bad for the Indians. I always sided with them, and I didn't know why until I got down to the Southwest. I figured, you know what? These are my bros. I mean, I understand them. I'm totally understanding of their mythology. I totally sympathize with them. I empathize with their plight. And when I go to Egypt, which kind of looks a bit like the Native American Southwest, I am equally at home as well. In fact, I'm very equally at home in any place that has that kind of red, orange sand. And I'm beginning to wonder whether there's some kind of a past life thing going on here because, and in Egypt, they're very warm towards me without me even knowing them. It's almost like there's an unspoken connection here. And it feels wonderful. And the same thing in the Southwest. I feel at home. I don't need a map. I know exactly where I am and I can remember things very quietly. So it'd be great to go back again. I can't wait.
Well, maybe when you're here, we can have a little gathering out on the land and do some of that cleaning
that you're
Twist
talking
my
about.
arm.
Is that going to cost me another drink?
Well, Bell Rock, I know it's become quite commercial in the last few years, but Bell Rock is very, very important. In fact, there's a lot of people in spiritual groups, they tend to build rainbow bridges, is the term. And what you do is you go on pilgrimage to a sacred site somewhere in the world. You take a little bit of the soil or either a little bit of a rock of a sacred site, and you put it into the next sacred site, and then wherever you've been, you take a little bit of the rock or the earth, and you take it back to yours. You're physically linking these sacred sites, even though they're all linked to each other by electromagnetic lines of force, as we know. And there is a lot of precious stones, a lot of soil from all parts of the world buried along Bell Rock. So anybody who's listening, don't go and dig it up. There's a reason why it's there. And you probably won't find it because it's so well integrated into the stone that you probably won't find it. But it's very important. It's one of those little anchor points, as are many places around Sedona. Cathedral Rock is another one. And I'm sure you know most of them. But twist my arm. Let's go out and play one evening.
Yeah, absolutely. That's going to be fantastic. I'll make it happen. I'll make it happen.
Absolutely. You're on.
All right. Well, it's been great talking to you. I really appreciate your time. I've enjoyed it thoroughly. I could just sit here and go on. The people listening might not be able to as much as myself.
Yeah, it'd be good. It'd be good to have fun with people in Sedona as well. I mean, half the fun of doing these conferences is not just you talking for hours and then selling books and DVDs. It's the fact that you get to hear information back. That's the bit that I like, sitting up at the bar, having a quiet drink, throwing a couple of jokes around, but hearing feedback, because sometimes those stories are what triggers you to move the information forward. And I can't tell you how many times that's happened, even at UFO conferences with NASA people, and they come dressed with, and there's one great moment in Roswell, and there's someone took a photograph of me at my table, and I'm looking very serious as a couple there, and they are dressed in monks' cowls. They have the cowl over the head, and they're wearing rubber lizard masks. And it looks like a normal everyday occurrence. There's a guy listening very tentatively to two reptiles, and they're doing this. And we were actually discussing hyperdimensional mathematics with two NASA engineers. That's how they get their kicks. And I don't know what the hell they were talking about because they were way above my head, but they're talking about advanced systems of propulsion based on the understanding of ancient mythology and also crop circles, incredibly enough. They take this stuff very seriously. And their way to let their hair down is to go dress as reptilians and blend in. So, and I learned so much from those 15 minutes of interaction with them. So that's why I enjoy about these things. It's meeting other people with a different point of view that gets you to expand your horizon. That's worth everything.
Well, we've definitely made some cool space for that. The place that we're having has a huge lobby and an outdoor patio. So May is going to be a great time. We're going to make a little cafeteria area. We're going to have a really nice food court and a DJ going with some multimedia imagery. Just so it's a real festive time for people to hang out like at the pub and share ideas. Although we won't be able to have alcohol there. We'll be able to go to the pub afterwards too.
God, I hope so. For all of you listening, boys and girls, the alcohol is called research, and you drink it in a research facility.
And it definitely helps the research, doesn't it?
It really does. I can't tell you how many times I've met with people back in England, good friends of mine who've written incredible works. We don't see each other for 5 years. We don't know what the hell we've been writing about. And we'll sit down, we'll destroy each other's egos for the first half hour. And then after 5 hours of drinking, we've accomplished so much work. I mean, really accomplished huge amounts of work because we were relaxed. You know, there's no ego. We're just exchanging information and fixing each other's problems in our research, and there's no ownership. It's a wonderful moment. So, ironically, it really does help. Actually, just loosens you up a little bit, and you can get a lot of stuff done. But then again, in England, you have to because it's usually wet, windy, and cold. So the only place to hide in the evening is the pub, anyway.
Yeah, that's right. Well, when I was in Europe, I noticed a lot of business happens at the pub.
Oh God, yeah.
Like most of it.
full of it. Yeah, I remember when I was back in advertising a long, long time ago. I was a creative director in London. We'd go down to they called my manager called it the branch office, and I said I didn't realize where the branch office. Yes, next door. That's the pub. Oh, okay. And we'd be there at 11:30 in the morning, and there'd be 5 pints of beer lined up. And I said, it's a bit early in the morning to start drinking all this beer. I said, no, 3 of those are for you to catch up with us. And that was my boss with the clients. And by 3 in the afternoon, I had sold this guy $100 million worth of advertising. And the next day, he calls me up with a headache, the boss, and says, no, it still looks good today. Thank God, because I signed off on that. There was a camaraderie, it was a functional alcoholism, if you want to call it that, but there was a camaraderie and people trusted each other. And I do miss that in terms of business. I don't miss advertising at all, but at least it's helped me to do my work, because much of what I learned in order to piece things together in terms of solving an issue, which is how do you sell this to a skeptical audience, has helped me understand how to write a book on how to sell an ancient civilization to a skeptical audience today. So again, you never throw everything out, because there's always useful to everything you do.
Well, again, thank you so much for your time. I'm really looking forward to having you here in Sedona, where we can have a few days for everyone to have a community time, connect and conjugate and see one another. So it's going to be really exciting for me. And after this conversation, I'm even excited, even more.
It's going to be fun.
It's going to be a lot of fun. So thank you again so much for your time.
Thanks, Robert. Appreciate it.